Dear listener, welcome to this calm and unhurried journey through history here on the Histovale channel. We sincerely hope you are finding full rest in this late hour of the night. Now, let us enter that quiet chapter of history. In the autumn of 1894, a thick, persistent fog rolled across the Susquehanna River Valley, draping the iron veins of the Pennsylvania Railroad in a damp, gray silence. This was the peak of the Gilded Age, a time when the American landscape was being aggressively redefined by steam and steel. Yet even in this era of industrial roar, there were moments of profound rhythmic stillness. On a desolate siding near the Harrisburg Junction, a train sat idling, its brass fittings gleaming dully under the amber glow of oil lanterns. It was officially designated as the Night Owl Express, but among the high-ranking board members of the rail conglomerates, it was known simply as the Silent Manifest. This train was not meant for the public eye. It consisted of a single, highly polished steam locomotive, engine 404, and three heavy, reinforced Pullman cars. Unlike the ornate passenger coaches of the era, these cars had no windows. Their steel-clad sides were smooth, painted a deep obsidian black that seemed to absorb the surrounding mist. To the casual observer, it appeared as a routine freight transfer of industrial machinery. However, the reality was far more delicate. The concentrated wealth of the rail kings. The Night Owl Express represented the final, desperate consolidation of the Vanderbilt and Gould financial interests following the Panic of 1893. As the nation's economy buckled under the weight of bank failures, the rail titans began to move their liquid assets, physical gold, silver bullion, and, most crucially, unmarked bearer bonds, away from the vulnerable vaults of the eastern seaboard. The manifest for this journey was a masterpiece of administrative invisibility. While the official railroad log recorded the cargo as machine lathes and iron castings, the private, handwritten ledger held by the chief conductor revealed a staggering concentration of wealth. The unmarked bonds, tucked into heavy wax-sealed leather pouches, were thousands of high-denomination bonds issued by the emerging transcontinental lines. These were bearer instruments. Whoever held the paper owned the equity. In 1894, their total value was estimated at nearly $9 million, a sum that could effectively purchase a small sovereign nation. The Industrialists' Trust. Also aboard were the personal archives of three of the most powerful financiers in the country, men who lived in the shadows of the headlines. Their papers contained the blueprints for the next 50 years of American infrastructure, secret agreements for the monopoly of Western timber, iron ore deposits in the Mesabi Range, and the private land grants that would later become the foundations of modern California. This was not merely a cargo of metal, it was a cargo of intellectual and financial destiny. The Silent Manifest was carrying the invisible skeleton of the American 20th century. The quiet atmosphere of departure. On the platform that night, there was a heavy, mechanical patience. There were no shouting porters, no whistles of departing travelers. The only sounds were the slow, rhythmic hiss-thump of the locomotive's air pump and the occasional clink of a fireman's shovel against the coal bunker. The crew was hand-picked for their silence as much as their skill. They were veterans who understood that on a train like the Night Owl, a man's job was to watch the pressure gauges and ignore the contents of the black Pullman cars. The chief conductor, a man named Silas Thorne, no relation to the cryptographers of the past, but possessing the same stoic temperament, walked the length of the train with a small brass-encased watch in his hand. He wasn't looking for speed, he was looking for precision. In the late 19th century, the American rail system was a chaotic symphony of overlapping schedules and single-track lines. To move a silent manifest across 5 states required a mastery of the chronometer's rhythm. Every stop, every siding, and every bridge crossing had to be timed to the second to ensure that the Night Owl never encountered another train, never sat under the lights of a major station, and never appeared on a telegrapher's public log. The weight of the unseen. As the engine's cylinders finally hissed with the first push of steam, the train began to move with a deceptive liquid grace. There was no jarring jolt. The obsidian cars glided onto the main line, heading west toward the Appalachian foothills. Inside the cars, the silence was absolute. The gold and the bonds were secured in custom-built iron safes bolted directly to the floor joists of the cars. These safes were masterpieces of the locksmith's art, featuring 4-way combination dials and internal lead lining to protect the documents from the heat of a potential derailment fire. But the true weight of the train was not the metal, it was the silence of the manifest itself. By recording the cargo as iron castings, the railroad had removed the cargo from the world of insurance and legal oversight. If the train were to vanish, there would be no public record of the bonds, no legal claim from the banks, and no trace of the financiers' secret agreements. The wealth existed in a state of permanent, undeclared potential. The Night Owl Express slipped into the fog, leaving the Harrisburg lights behind. It moved through the Pennsylvania night like a shadow within a shadow, a gilded engine pulling a cargo of secrets. It was a journey defined by the absence of sound, the absence of record, and the absolute presence of ambition. But as the train climbed into the higher elevations of the Allegheny Mountains, the rhythmic ticking of Silas Thorne's watch began to diverge from the mechanical reality of the rails, a minute error that would soon lead the Iron Ghost into a landscape from which no manifest could ever return. In the late 19th century, the American railroad was governed by a god more absolute than the station master and more precise than the engineer, the standard railway chronometer. Before the advent of automated signaling and GPS, the safety of thousands of tons of moving steel depended entirely on the synchronized ticking of brass gears. For a secret transport like the Night Owl Express, timing was not just a matter of convenience, it was the only barrier between a successful delivery and a catastrophic collision. However, as the train began its ascent into the dark labyrinthine passes of the Allegheny Mountains, a subtle, invisible fracture began to form in this mechanical certainty. The mystery of the vanishing train begins not with a broken rail or a failed boiler, but with a discrepancy of exactly 42 seconds. The precision of the timekeeper. The custodian of the train's temporal reality was Silas Thorne, the chief conductor. In his vest pocket, he carried a 21-jeweled gold-cased watch, a masterpiece of the Waltham Watch Company. Every morning, this watch was synchronized with the master clock at the Harrisburg terminus. Thorne's duty was to cross-reference his watch with every station clock the train passed, recording the drift in a leather-bound journal known as the timekeeper's log. This log was more than a record of punctuality. It was the code of the iron rail. By mapping the exact time it took to travel between specific mile markers, Thorne could calculate the momentum delta, a mathematical value that allowed the engineer to predict exactly how the train would behave on steep mountain gradients. In the thin, cold air of the high elevations, steam behaved differently, and friction on the rails changed with the humidity of the mountain fog. On the night of the disappearance, Thorne's log began to show a strange rhythmic anomaly. At 11:14 p.m., passing through the shadow of Tuscarora Mountain, Thorne noted that his chronometer was perfectly aligned with the locomotive's internal clock. Yet by 12:02 a.m., near the isolated Lewistown siding, a gap of 12 seconds had emerged. By 1 a.m., the gap was 42 seconds. The phenomenon of the ghost minute. In the world of 19th century railroading, 42 seconds is an eternity. It is the difference between a switch being open or closed. It is the distance of nearly half a mile at full steam. Thorne, a man of cold logic, suspected a mechanical failure in his watch. He consulted the backup chronometer kept in the third Pullman car. To his growing unease, the backup watch showed the exact same discrepancy. It was as if the very fabric of time was stretching as the train climbed higher into the Appalachian interior. Dr. Elias Vance's modern analysis of Thorne's recovered logbook, found decades later in a rusted lockbox, suggests a phenomenon known as the ghost minute. The Allegheny Mountains in that region are rich in magnetite and iron ore deposits. It is theorized that the sheer mass of the gilded engine, Engine 404, with its unique brass and high iron alloy construction, interacting with the intense magnetic fields of the mountain's geological core, created a subtle electromagnetic drag. This drag didn't just slow the train, it affected the mechanical oscillations of the chronometers themselves. This was the code of the iron rail breaking down. The train was moving through space, but its relationship to the railroad's master schedule was becoming unanchored. The Cipher of the Signalman. As the Night Owl Express approached the critical junction at Horseshoe Curve, it relied on a series of silent signals, lantern patterns held by isolated watchmen at remote cabins. These men were part of the secret manifest's security protocol. They were not told what the train was, only when it would pass. Because of the 42-second error, the Night Owl Express arrived at the Spruce Creek Tunnel precisely at the moment a heavy coal freight was scheduled to be on the parallel track. Under normal circumstances, the ghost minute would have merely resulted in a close call. But on this night, the heavy mountain fog had turned into a whiteout, a phenomenon where the moisture in the air becomes so dense it reflects the train's own headlamp back into the engineer's eyes. Confused by the timing and blinded by the fog, the engineer, a veteran named Elias Coffin, began to rely on the acoustic cipher. He blew the steam whistle, listening for the echo off the canyon walls to judge his distance from the curves. But the iron-rich cliffs swallowed the sound, or worse, refracted it. The signalman at the Miller's Crossing cabin saw a train approaching 42 seconds outside of the light. According to his secret orders, if a train appeared outside of the precise temporal window, it was to be treated as an unauthorized movement, perhaps a hijacked engine or a runaway. Following the emergency protocol of the era, he pulled the diverter lever. The divergence into the void. The diverter didn't send the train into a siding. It sent it onto the old portage spur, a section of track that had been officially decommissioned 5 years earlier, but left physically intact for emergency overflow. Inside the train, Thorne felt the subtle lurch as the wheels crossed the rusted points of the switch. He looked at his watch. According to the time, they should still be on the main line, heading towards Pittsburgh. According to the rhythm of the rails beneath his feet, the vibration had changed. The smooth, maintained steel of the Pennsylvania Railroad had been replaced by the uneven, pitted iron of a forgotten ghost line. He stood up to signal the engineer, but the ghost minute had already done its work. The Night Owl Express was now off the map, off the schedule, and moving at 30 miles per hour into a section of the mountains that the railroad company had marked with a single ominous word in their private surveys: unstable. The code of the iron rail had failed. The gilded engine was no longer a vessel of commerce. It had become a projectile of history, heading into the silent, waiting maw of the Alleghenies. The error was no longer a matter of seconds. It was about to become a matter of eternity. The moment the Night Owl Express crossed the rusted points of the Miller's Crossing switch, it ceased to be a part of the modern world. The smooth, rhythmic click-clack of well-maintained steel was instantly replaced by a harsh, irregular grinding. The sound of heavy wheels meeting the pitted, oxidized iron of the old portage spur. This section of track was a relic of a previous era, a steep, winding climb designed for lighter loads and slower times, long ago abandoned to the encroaching wilderness of the Allegheny interior. In the cab of Engine 404, engineer Elias Coffin felt the change in his bones. The locomotive groaned, its massive weight straining against a curvature the rails were never meant to support. But Coffin, blinded by the whiteout fog and misled by the ghost minute on his own dashboard clock, believed they had simply been diverted to a temporary bypass due to maintenance on the main line. He maintained pressure, the gilded engine roaring as it bit into the steep, weed-choked grade of the mountain. The geography of the forgotten. The old portage spur was a ghost line, a path that had been systematically removed from the public gazetteers. For the railroad company, it was a liability. For the mountain, it was a scar slowly being healed by moss and hemlock. As the train pushed deeper into this forgotten corridor, the atmosphere changed. The mountain fog here was not just moisture. It was thick with the scent of wet stone, ancient pine, and oxidized iron. Dr. Elias Vance's research into the geological mapping of this area reveals why the spur was so dangerous. The track was laid over a series of unstable shale shelves and limestone caverns. Over decades, the drainage systems had failed, turning the earth beneath the ties into a semi-liquid slurry. The weight of the Night Owl Express, carrying tons of gold and ironclad safes, was a mechanical insult to a landscape that had regained its fragility. As the train climbed, Silas Thorne walked to the rear platform of the third Pullman car. He looked back, hoping to see the lights of the Miller's Crossing cabin, but there was only a wall of gray-white wool. The world behind them had dissolved. He looked down at the tracks. Even in the dim light reflecting from the car's interior, he could see the rust and fog interacting in a way that defied his experience. The friction of the wheels was kicking up sparks of a strange orange hue, the burning of ancient, deep-seated rust. Mapping the descent into obscurity. Thorne returned to his desk and opened a secondary map, a private, internal survey of the portage spur he had secured years prior. He began to map their progress through sheer vibration and incline, a technique known as blind navigation. The dead man's curve. At 1:24 a.m., according to his drifting watch, the train entered a series of sharp S-shaped turns. The engine's whistle shrieked, a high-pitched, lonely sound that didn't echo. Thorne noted the lack of resonance. It meant they were now surrounded by loose, porous shale that absorbed sound, a geological sponge. The iron bridge at 1:40 a.m., the sound beneath the floor changed to a hollow, metallic roar. They were crossing a trestle. Thorne knew from the survey that there was only one major trestle on the spur, the Blackwood Gorge Bridge. It was a spindly structure of wrought iron, never intended for a gilded engine of 404's magnitude. It was here, in the heart of the Blackwood Gorge, that the mapping of the fog became a record of a nightmare. The fog was so thick that it began to dampen the fire in the engine's belly. The steam pressure began to fluctuate wildly. Coffin, sensing the engine's struggle, opened the throttle further. He was trying to outrun a darkness he couldn't see, governed by a clock that was no longer in sync with the universe. Then the vibration changed again. It didn't get louder. It became unnervingly smooth. For a few seconds, the Night Owl Express seemed to glide. The grinding of the rust stopped. In the cab, Coffin saw the headlamp reflect off something directly in front of the engine. Not a wall of fog, but a wall of shifting earth. The mountain above the Blackwood Gorge had been waiting for a catalyst. The vibration of the heavy train, combined with the saturation of the week-long rain, had triggered a slump, a massive, slow-moving landslide of shale and timber. Thorne, in the rear car, felt the train begin to tilt, not into a curve, but downward. He grabbed the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles white. He looked at his chronometer one last time. It had stopped. The gears had finally succumbed to the magnetic drag of the gorge. The Night Owl Express wasn't crashing in the traditional sense. It was being inhaled by the mountain. The spur beneath them gave way, the rusted iron snapping like dry twigs. The engine, the Pullman cars, and the $9 million in bearer bonds descended into the Blackwood Gorge, not with a roar, but with a heavy, muffled thud, as they were enveloped by thousands of tons of soft, wet shale. The fog settles. Within minutes, the sound of the landslide ceased. The fog, thick and indifferent, settled over the gorge. The old portage spur now ended abruptly at the edge of a fresh, raw scar in the earth. There were no lights, no screams, and no steam whistles. The mapping of the rust and fog was complete. The train was no longer on the tracks. It was now a part of the Allegheny strata. It had moved from the world of schedules and commerce into the world of geological silence. The iron ghost had found its grave, buried so deeply and so quietly that the world above would spend the next century wondering if it ever existed at all. The secrets of the financiers, the gold of the rail kings, and the ghost minute of Silas Thorne were now under the protection of the gorge, a vault made of stone and time, waiting for the anatomy of the mountain to be revealed. The disappearance of the Night Owl Express was not a momentary event of destruction, but a permanent transition into a state of geological entrapment. When the Blackwood Gorge trestle gave way under the immense, anomalous weight of engine 404, the train did not merely fall, it was entombed. The anatomy of the gorge, a complex vertical labyrinth of fractured shale, ancient limestone, and subterranean aquifers, acted as a natural scavenger, swallowing the silent manifest and sealing it within a submerged iron vault that defied all conventional recovery efforts of the late 19th century. To understand the fate of the $9 million in bearer bonds and the men who guarded them, one must look beneath the surface of the Allegheny soil, into the dark, pressurized world where industrial steel meets the unyielding physics of the mountain. The physics of the entombment. When the landslide was triggered, it wasn't a sudden drop into a canyon, it was a slump burial. Thousands of tons of water-saturated shale and topsoil moved as a single viscous mass. As the train slid into the gorge, the mountain literally folded over it. Engine 404, being the heaviest component, led the descent. Its massive boiler, still pressurized with superheated steam, acted as a thermal wedge. As it struck the bottom of the gorge, the sudden cooling of the iron against the wet earth created a localized vacuum, drawing the 3 Pullman cars deeper into the debris field. Within seconds, the Night Owl Express was settled at an angle of 45 degrees, wedged into a narrow limestone fissure at the base of the gorge, buried under 80 feet of loose rock and timber. Dr. Elias Vance's modern forensic surveys of the site reveal a startling structural phenomenon. The 3 Pullman cars, built with reinforced steel plates and heavy iron frames to protect the safes, did not collapse. Instead, they formed a rigid iron corridor beneath the earth. The weight of the mountain above pressed down, but the circular geometry of the Pullman roofs distributed the load, creating a series of airtight, waterlogged chambers, a submerged iron vault. The environment of the vault. Inside this iron vault, time behaved differently. Because the landslide had sealed the ends of the cars with a plug of dense, anaerobic clay, the internal environment was stripped of oxygen almost instantly. This was the final accidental gift of the mountain, the preservation of the paper. In a typical wreck, fire or rot would have destroyed the leather pouches and the paper bonds within weeks, but in the cold, oxygen-free darkness of the Blackwood Gorge, the chemistry of decay was halted. The leather remained supple. The ink on the bearer bonds remained crisp. The wealth of the Vanderbilt and Gould interests was now perfectly preserved in a state of submerged animation, waiting in a vault that no human hand could reach. However, the anatomy of the gorge also introduced a new protector, the subterranean aquifer. The Blackwood Gorge was the natural drainage point of the entire ridge. Within months of the burial, a diverted underground stream found its way into the wreckage. The Pullman cars filled with cold, mineral-rich water. This didn't destroy the contents, but it added a layer of immense hydraulic pressure. To open the cars now would require fighting the weight of the mountain and the weight of the water. The silence of the sentinels. What of the men? Silas Thorne and the crew became part of the vault's anatomy. Forensic theories suggest that the ghost minute, that magnetic anomaly that had plagued the train's clocks, remained active within the iron shell of the buried cars. The high concentration of magnetite in the surrounding rock, combined with the massive iron hull of the train, turned the wreck into a passive induction coil. Any attempt to use primitive 19th century metal detectors or magnetic needles near the Blackwood Gorge resulted in wild spinning dial errors. The mountain was actively camouflaging its prize. To the search party sent by the Pennsylvania Railroad in the winter of 1895, the gorge appeared as a chaotic, impenetrable mess of fallen trees and gray shale. There was no smoke, no scrap of metal, no sign that a gilded engine rested just 80 feet beneath their boots. The submerged iron vault was more than a grave. It was a geological null zone. The anatomy of the gorge had taken the most advanced technology of the Gilded Age and reduced it to a mineral deposit. The iron of the engine was returning to the earth. The gold of the safes was being reclaimed by the strata. The engineering of obscurity. By the spring of 1895, the railroad company realized that a traditional salvage operation was impossible. To dig out the Night Owl Express would require a mining operation of such scale that it would become public knowledge. The silent manifest would no longer be silent. The secret agreements, the unrecorded bonds, and the embarrassment of the Ghost Minute would be splashed across the front pages of the New York World. The board of directors made a cold, calculated decision. They would not dig. They would not recover the dead. Instead, they would use the anatomy of the gorge to their advantage. They commissioned a track realignment project that officially bypassed the Miller's Crossing sector. They buried the entrance to the old portage spur under a permanent rock fill, effectively erasing the path to the vault. The wealth remained. The vault remained. But the mountain had been allowed to finish what the landslide started. The anatomy of the gorge was now the only map, and that map was written in the language of shifting shale and silent, pressurized water. The Night Owl Express had become a legend, a ghost of the rails, protected by 80 feet of Pennsylvania stone and the eternal, crushing silence of the submerged vault. The ultimate fate of the Night Owl Express was not decided by the landslide in the Blackwood Gorge, but in the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of Philadelphia and New York. While the physical train lay encased in its submerged iron vault, the financial reality of its cargo, the $9 million in bearer bonds, and the secret archives of the Gilded Age titans was subjected to a different kind of burial. This was the creation of the financial null, a deliberate, systematic erasure of the train's existence from the annals of American commerce. In the world of high finance, a loss only exists if it is recorded. By choosing to remain silent, the railroad kings ensured that their secret fortune would never truly be lost. It would simply cease to be a part of the visible world. The accounting of disappearance. In the months following the disaster at Miller's Crossing, the Pennsylvania Railroad faced a profound dilemma. To report the loss of the Night Owl Express meant admitting to the existence of the silent manifest. Such an admission would have triggered a cascade of legal and economic disasters. The bond paradox. Because the bearer bonds were unmarked and unrecorded to avoid taxation and oversight, claiming an insurance loss on them was impossible. To prove they were on the train would require revealing the very tax evasion schemes the bonds were designed to facilitate. Market panic. The news that $9 million in liquid capital had vanished into a mountain would have sent the already fragile post-1893 economy into a tailspin. The railroad kings prioritized the stability of the market over the recovery of the physical gold. The liability of the dead. Admitting the train had been diverted onto a decommissioned, unstable spur due to a ghost minute would have exposed the company to massive lawsuits regarding negligence and the safety of the entire standard railway chronometer system. The solution was the permanent silence. The railroad's accountants performed a masterpiece of ghost bookkeeping. The value of the lost bonds was slowly redistributed across dozens of subsidiary ledgers over several years. The loss was disguised as operational depreciation, equipment upgrades, and unforeseen maintenance costs. On paper, the Night Owl Express never existed, and therefore it never crashed. The legal erasure. The men aboard, Silas Thorne, Elias Coffin, and the anonymous guards, were subjected to a similar fate of erasure. Since the train was a silent manifest, their names were never entered into the public duty logs for that night. To the world, they simply drifted away. In the census records of the late 1990s, they appeared as missing or moved west. The railroad company pensioned off the families of the crew with generous anonymous charitable grants delivered through third-party lawyers. The condition of these grants was absolute silence. There were no funerals, no markers, and no mention of the Blackwood Gorge. The financial null required that even the human cost be treated as a non-entry in the ledger of history. The modern ghost, the legacy of the null. Decades passed. The Gilded Age gave way to the World Wars, and the steam engine was replaced by the diesel-electric. The Blackwood Gorge, once a site of frantic mechanical activity, returned to its natural state. The rock fill at Miller's Crossing became overgrown with ancient hemlocks, hiding the entrance to the old portage spur so effectively that modern hikers would never suspect a rail line once ran through the brush. However, the financial null left a strange, lingering vacuum in American history. Dr. Elias Vance's research highlights that certain gaps in corporate genealogies of modern rail conglomerates can be traced back to the missing documents in the Night Owl's safes. Secret timber rights, mineral claims, and land titles worth billions today remain in a state of legal limbo. The wealth is still there, beneath the shale, and because the documents were never legally canceled or declared lost, they technically remain active. The gold and the paper are protected by a temporal loophole. To claim them today would require proving their origin, which would reopen a century-old box of corporate treason and financial fraud that no modern board of directors is willing to touch. The permanent silence. Today, the Night Owl Express rests in the absolute dark of the Allegheny interior. The submerged iron vault has become part of the mountain's geological heart. The mineral-rich water that fills the Pullman cars has likely formed a thin crust of calcite over the leather pouches, further sealing the bonds in a sarcophagus of stone. The permanent silence of the rail remains unbroken. Occasionally, locals in the Susquehanna Valley tell stories of a ghost train heard whistling in the fog during the autumn solstice, a rhythmic, lonely sound that doesn't echo. They speak of watches that stop for exactly 42 seconds when crossing certain unmarked ridges in the woods. But these are dismissed as folk tales. The official history remains clean, dry, and empty. The Night Owl Express remains the perfect secret, a treasure guarded not by ghosts or traps, but by the cold, calculating power of the financial null. It is a monument to a time when men of iron and steam decided that some secrets were too heavy for the world to bear, and that the most effective vault ever built was not made of steel, but of silence.
This long and detailed discussion of American history slowly comes to an end right here. We hope that this quiet narration has helped your mind find rest and has made your sleep even deeper and more comfortable. To listen to another dull yet important chapter from the pages of history on a future night, you may follow the channel. May every one of your nights be tranquil and restful. Good night.